Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Real Estate Show on KCMX News Media 880 and on YouTube at realestateshowOregon.com. I'm Pete Belcastro. This is Alice Lema. We're both real estate brokers with John L. Scott in Southern Oregon. We get together with you once a week here on the radio and on YouTube to talk about real estate. What's going on in Jackson, Josephine, Klamath counties, Southern Oregon area. Commercial, residential, renters, well, investors. We kind of got a little bit of information for everybody today as well, right?
Yep, and we still have a lot of farm properties that are for sale, and they're selling more quickly now. That's something we should talk about.
Have you seen how they're, just take a side trip here, down the hemp road. Have you seen how they're harvesting this stuff
It's
around?
quite interesting, yes, because it looks like they're doing it by hand.
Yes.
And I couldn't see what implement they were using, but some kind of a big knife or sickle.
I've seen them chop the whole plant down.
Right,
I've seen that.
right, and then
I've seen people strip off of it too. Anyway, I'm not.
Sometimes they're stripping there, and sometimes they're stripping in the processing area.
I tell you, it's not going to go away, as you know. And but look, we've already had fires from people trying to dry it.
Incorrectly
in old barns with bad electricity. I mean, all the different things that are out there. So please be careful around it. But it's certainly happening, and it looks like there's buyers out there for this crop.
Yes.
The Mail Tribune had a big story this weekend.
Yes, and Oregon apparently is at the top of the list of desirability. They really, really like the Oregon hemp.
Because we're the golden triangle.
We're the golden triangle.
And people want that. Anyway, that's a side story, but God, does that dominate so many conversations you have with people lately.
But also, to go back to the fires and the accidental things that are happening in buildings, that is a subject of happening because there's not enough processing plants.
Right.
And people are actually reaching out to farmers who have these outbuildings, and they may or may not be up to code for having this level of commercial activity in it, and then it's causing problems. And it's not just with wiring, it's with plumbing as well.
Yeah.
But it's because there's a shortage of commercial spaces for these folks to do the processing and drying.
And what was really disheartening, and we did a show on this, remember, back a few months ago with Simon Hare, what's so disheartening to hear as we go through this is that they're taking the crop out of the area. They're processing it somewhere else. Those jobs are somewhere else.
Well, and you predicted that. You predicted, yep.
Anyway, so that's just kind of the things going on. But it's fascinating to watch it happen.
Well, and it's exciting for our area because having the jobs, it's sustainable, it's repeatable, it's not illegal.
Yeah.
So
no, it's not. But on the other hand, it's really made a mess out of the hay business right now because the price of hay has really gone up because of a shortage because they're growing hemp. Hemp is also a food source for animals, you know. I'm curious if that develops as well. So anyway, that's all out there. Today on the show, what we talked about is what are the things that buyers and sellers see all the time that gets you in trouble at the end of things, or how do we go through this process of making everybody feel okay about it.
And closing smoothly. Yeah. And closing smoothly is an operation of many, many levels all simultaneously. And you just had a closing up in Klamath. Yeah. And there was a little surprise when you got up there to get possession of your property.
Well, the biggest thing that happens in here are the closing dates. You know, this is the date it's going to close. And how in the world do we decipher when I move in, when the person's going to go out, when I'm going to move
Especially
in,
if it's a larger property, somebody who's been there for a long time, or somebody who is physically handicapped, alone, a little bit disabled, maybe waited too long to downsize or right size, and then they just have this big job on their hands.
So what do you tell clients regarding the closing date, moving out? I mean, you can do different things. You can occupy before closing. You can occupy after closing for the seller. You can do all sorts of things. But boy, they really complicate.
Right. Well, the first
thing.
Do
you like those things? Do you do
well,
much of that?
you know, it happens a lot just because there's so many people selling a property and then buying at the same time. You know, everybody's trying to do these kind of domino things. But what I do tell them is do not make any firm plans with any movers or help or family until you have the appraisal report back. And you have to wait until that report is back. Lately, we've had some appraisals not coming in.
Yeah.
Hard to negotiate. One of them, I don't know if you remember hearing, it was $28,000 below.
Wow.
And the original offer was low. So you just don't know what's going to happen. So don't make firm plans. But also, if you're selling, be ready.
Ready to
be
what?
ready to be out of the property.
On the close date, right?
Depending, well, look at your contract and find out what date you're supposed to be out.
Some people will say, and I don't know if you do this, or some people will say a seller will go, all right, I'm gonna keep the close date on this date, but I'm gonna occupy the property for 3 days after closing before I'm out.
Well, and if you're older, if you have some physical issues, or there's just a sheer huge amount of stuff, that's a good idea if the buyer will go along with it, or at least 24 hours after closing.
Do you see that a lot?
Well, when I have an older person or somebody with a lot of stuff, they've just been there for decades, then I do ask permission from the seller if we can work that out so that from the buyer. So my seller has a lot of stuff and they're older and they're not quite ready. I do ask for a day or so if that's okay with the buyer so that they can finish moving.
So if that's not so, what if the seller? I'm trying to think here. Occupying before closing. Okay, go back to the buyer side here for a minute.
Oh yeah, because we just
do you do that often? I mean, it's so interesting.
Well, that's
to
tricky.
Occupy the property
before
and the request will come from, say, an agent with the buyer. They're saying, we're here, you're out. Can we occupy? We need to move in now. Can we get in?
Can we
get
put stuff
in early?
In the garage?
Can we put stuff in the garage, store things?
Yeah.
All the time happens.
Can we sleep in our camper on the property? And there's pluses and minuses to that because there's a lot of legalities. There's a lot of insurance. We've had situations where people were allowed to put their stuff in the garage, and then there was a fire, and all their stuff burned down before close. So what do you do in that situation? All your stuff is gone. The house didn't close. Now you don't have a house to buy. It's very, very complicated to do that.
And sellers, I think, ask that question.
And should
ask when that request come. And I think for the most part, I'm with you kind of on that particular issue of just saying, look, we have closing dates. We've all agreed to them. We need to stick to them because sellers generally are not. And I hate to ask them. I don't even like asking them to do an occupy before closing, generally, unless it's really circumstances. We're almost there, right?
Right, unless there's something that happens that's unforeseen and there's a delay.
Yeah.
There's a delay in the closing date, and then you have to try to accommodate all these humans and possible animals. We had a situation where somebody had horses, was moving across country. This happened this summer, and the seller did not have the property ready. They did not get out on time. They didn't have it clean. They didn't have all their possessions moved out, and so they forced a 4-day delay after the buyer had already loaded up 4 horses, 7 dogs, kids, the whole thing.
We're coming, and that's something
right,
else
and that
happens.
was very, very complicated, and I thought kind of unfair, but there we were, so that does happen.
Yeah, so be aware of those things of occupy before closing. Generally, sellers are going to say no. I mean,
because of the legalities, and if they do say yes, then you need to make sure that the person moving in has insurance.
And you fill out the right paperwork,
fill out the
all
right
that kind of thing for
and
that.
Possibly pay a per diem.
I mean, I've done both. I mean, we've had occupy before, and after. I've had either sometimes sellers, before they're out, and they'll say, "Here's the key to a buyer," and say, "Just go ahead." So it all depends. The point being that you really need to know what's happening with that. Because it just makes it so much smoother at the end.
Well, and just be honest with your agent and try to facilitate communication with the other side, regardless of what side you're on. Yeah. We just had a situation where a buyer felt they needed to terminate the transaction because the seller could not accommodate early occupancy. This particular buyer wanted in before the appraisal was back, and the seller just didn't feel comfortable about that, and the buyer walked. And this is already after being in escrow for 2.5 weeks. So but there was nothing that could be done about that situation. The seller was not comfortable having them in their house.
And you make a very good point that waiting until the appraisal comes back, because that's that final piece that's needed. Because by the time the appraisal comes back, you've already done your inspections, generally. You should have. And so that appraisal is the last piece of that puzzle that goes in there. So you're right,
I think it's easier to do after the appraisal's
to say yes
back.
if it's there, right? Because
right.
It's pretty much going to close.
Right, but you need to have all those legal protections. And that renter's insurance, remember we had Dave Hallett on from Farmers Insurance. He was talking about renter's insurance. Well, if you are a buyer and you're moving things even into the garage, you're not sleeping on the property, but just leaving your work trailer because you have to move it from where you're at. You need to have extra insurance on that in case something happens.
Closings, they're an interesting time.
They can be.
Oh my goodness! And you see, I mean, the thing is, it's stressful enough, and we try to reduce the stress on everybody. And just keep, once you reach your agreement, try to stick to it. I guess that's the bottom line, right?
If you really can't, if you're selling and you cannot be out, then the other side needs to know that. They need to know why, and they need to know what you're going to do about it so that you can get it done as quickly as possible.
And as Alice said, sometimes you've got dominoes where this person has to close first. They're buying your place. You're buying another place. You're sold to these guys, and so on down the line. And so you really have to be aware of those lines and be patient with people too sometimes, because everything, some things are out of our control or out of your control, and it just makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, we've had situations where everything was done properly. We're at the very end. Everybody's already signed their papers, and then one of the parties passes.
Yeah. Oh.
And it, in that particular case, it was resolved, but it took an extra 4 weeks. And so everybody was patient, but it was very stressful. It was very hard. The people moving in had to renegotiate with their landlord who had already rented to somebody else. So talk about dominoes, lots of life issues.
And if you're a renter, one thing to also to maybe consider is if you're renting is your close date. You don't want your close date to go right up against, say, the end of the month, and you've given your notice you're going to be out the end of the month. You need to give yourself a little cushion there.
Yeah.
Because you may not be able to get in, and then you're all of a sudden you got to be out of your apartment. They've rented it, and all things just go crazy.
Right. And in that situation, if you can have an open communication with your landlord and tell them what you're doing and wait till the appraisal comes back, you still will have some overlap. And that's the part everybody's trying to slice. They don't want to pay for 2 days at 2 places. Go ahead and pay for that. Have a week. Yeah. Have a week of overlap just to be safe.
Just to be safe. So again, real estate advisor would help you with that, because that's really important, that how to close. I mean, just getting the offer accepted, it doesn't end the thing.
Oh, that's just the beginning.
And it goes on and on. Hey, next week here on the show, Guy Giles, as we said, was going to be with us from Mutual of Omaha Mortgage. He's going to bring along the Jackson County assessor.
Oh, this will be so good.
Because, hey, we're at the end of October and the 1st of November, and that means the property tax statements are going to be in the mail. And it's always interesting to see what value is placed by the assessor on Jackson County overall median price, what that is, and how much that has gone up or down. And I'm so curious how that's going to be this year.
Well, and it's going to be very interesting which neighborhoods got the biggest increases. Do you know there's some properties in East Medford that are $9,000 a year already? That was 2018.
$9,000
a year in property
taxes.
And they're in town. They're not on the hill. They're not the big fancy spreads. $9,000. So I can't wait to see if that address goes down or up.
Well, and again, if you have new construction, they're going to come out now and going to put a value on your place.
See, and a lot of people don't know that when you do that, you don't have your tax number.
You see, that's right. You see new construction with a $800 tax built to it, and that just not going to last long.
No, that's for the lot.
Well, no, just until it's improved and somebody comes and looks at it. Anyway, that'll be next week with the assessor. I love talking to him about all
that's
going
to be a good show.
It's always a fascinating show. Hey, Pete and Alice here today on the Real Estate Show. We got a break coming up. Don't forget you can check out any of our past shows at realestateShowOregon.com. We're coming right back to KCMX and to YouTube.com right after this. Welcome back to the Real Estate Show on KCMX News Media 880 and YouTube at realestateShowOregon.com. Pete Belcastro and Alice Lema here in the house with you today, and thanks for joining us mid-October. I've always thought that fall was the time you slow down as the weather changes and things. But I'm really optimistic. I think you hit it right on the nose in the previous segment. I think this fall, with interest rates, so much activity commercial-wise, that we're kind of going to defy that cycle that's this way.
People are choosing to make their life changes right this second so they could grab onto that low interest rate. They can get the bigger, better spread, that dream home they've always wanted. They can move out of the smaller house. Maybe they're having a bigger family. Maybe they're having their elders move in. And if they're downsizing, they have the most buyers right now because the rates are lower. There's more people out there to buy their home.
Yeah, and again, people are refinancing right now because these rates are low. that combination, again, with a lot of interest. Remember, about 40% of the sales are from out of town, people moving here. The other parts are people moving up and down the scale all across. I got a lot of young couples as buyers, young people buying.
Well, the millennials are finally starting to buy their homes, and yes, they're starting to do some studies, and the reports are coming in. They're predicting 1 out of 4 millennials will be buying a house or wanting to buy a house in the next 5 years.
Well, I'm
finally it's kicking in. Yeah, and that's been very hard for them. A lot of them went through the crash. They're caretaking their elders. They have student debt. This has been a long time coming.
Yeah, well, that's really good news to hear. And there's new developments coming along. That the planning commissions have been awfully busy, especially in Medford, regarding new construction, new developments that are coming on. So the housing, maybe that housing inventory is being helped along here, I'm hoping.
Well, I think we have more, and there's more coming.
The problem right now in terms of selling is that there's not, and when you get to the fall, we got lower inventory. So the inventory has come down a little bit, Alice. So that's why right now there's so many buyers out there. Stuff is still going pretty darn fast. I mean, if it's priced right,
and looks good and is financeable,
I can move in tomorrow, and that's such a big thing. You're going to get an offer on it.
Yeah.
There's no question about that.
Yeah, and if it needs work, then you just need to be ready for lower offers or having to have the work done before closing. So that's another point to bring up to kind of help smooth out the closing process is if you already know there's something wrong with your property just because you've lived there or you did an inspection, then have a plan, have some money set aside, or have a financial lifeline that you can reach out to so that can get done so it's not holding up the sale or costing you more money because the price is going to be so low.
It's about taking control of your sale, right?
Mm-hmm, and being prepared.
And we've talked about this many times about a pre-home inspection if you're going to be selling, especially if you have an older home. New construction, not necessarily, but certainly older homes. You recommend that, I know, and I certainly do now because you know what to expect. And you get ahead of it before the buyer comes along, right?
Yeah, and the more damaged your property is, or the more rough, or however you want to say it, or outdated, the more the buyers are going to negotiate on that if they come look at it at all. So I'm a big fan of not only having the inspection, but the worst situation, the more you need it.
Yeah. What's the worst thing you think when buyers come into a home today looking at? What do you think is one of the biggest thing that they look at? And maybe want to change or see or comment on. Any idea what that you think that might be?
Well, they comment on everything.
I know. Okay. That's true. I'm gonna say flooring.
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 Because they don't like carpet.
Flooring is just a big thing. It seems like.
Well, people are afraid of carpet now.
It's amazing. You see carpet carpet, and they go,
even new carpet.
I want to get rid of this first thing.
Yeah.
Carpet's good in the bedrooms, down the hallway, and that's about it anymore. It's interesting. Throw rugs are different, but carpet is just...
Well, and it has to do with cleanliness, and there's so many more people, so much more of our population has breathing issues, and carpet seems to aggravate that.
Could be, okay. Yeah, well, that makes sense. It's definitely there in changing along the way. So again, be aware of those kinds of things. I want to talk for a second, if I could, with you about closing costs. And closing costs. Again, this is one of those areas where if you're buying or selling, you get these, they send you all this information, title company send you this, lender sends you this, and all this information comes down to you. And you always look at that closing cost. And so people will say if a buyer, they recommend you pay your own closing costs, you can ask the seller to pay your closing costs.
But a lot of people don't really understand what all that is.
Would you explain that? How do you explain that to some? Because it's such a big deal. That sometimes
it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. Yeah. And I think the sellers don't understand how much money is involved on the buyer's side, and then they're surprised when the buyer's offer includes a credit for up to 3%, which is a lot of money in some cases. So I think just explaining to everybody from the beginning, I don't know what you do, but just trying to give them a heads up so the seller understands the buyer is probably going to have to bring in another $9,000 on top of their down payment. And the buyer needs to understand that the seller doesn't have to credit that. So just so that everybody's prepared.
Do you? What is some of your that you've seen? I've seen, the seller pay the whole thing. for the buyer.
Yeah, if it's a good enough offer, they will.
I've seen buyers offer or to the seller, they'll pay half of them.
And yeah, that's a good idea. Actually, that is a really good idea.
Half of it works, or up to so much money.
But then the buyer has to have that in cash reserves.
Right. And the biggest things in closing costs, why are closing costs so much? What are closing costs? Why am I paying $10,000-$15,000 in closing costs?
Yeah, and it didn't used to be like that too. This is more common since the crash, don't you think?
Is it?
Yeah, because it just seems like since the crash, there's more rules about the impounds. That's what they call the collecting of the taxes up front,
right?
And the insurance. You have to have all that paid up front now, and you used to have more choices before the crash.
And that's what I really wanted to caution you on that of the closing costs. The closing costs themselves, I think, like in my deal that I just did, were around $2,000 maybe. I think the appraisal was in there, the fee, the application, all the fees, around $2,500 probably. The rest of it were all prepaid, which was taxes.
So you're actually separating.
I separate them out.
Okay.
Closing costs and prepaids are two totally different things. Why can't I just ask the seller to pay the closing costs, and I can pay my own prepaids? Because otherwise, you're asking the seller to pay your upfront a year's worth of your property taxes in homeowners insurance and mortgage insurance.
Right. Well, and in a really soft market or a property that's difficult to sell, it would behoove the seller to go for that and to maybe even advertise they were willing to do that. But it's case by case. Not every seller has enough equity to do that.
Yes, that's true too. You're up against, I got so much money, this is all I can do. I can't help you with closing costs. So closing costs can wreck a deal, right? This happens all the time.
Right. And if the appraisal comes in low and it comes in low for almost the exact amount of the closing costs, that's really, really hard, because then the seller feels that it's the buyer's problem that it came in low for the closing costs, and the buyer had not asked for those closing costs. The appraisal would have been just fine. And then the buyer thinks, well, I still can't buy the house, and the appraisal came in low. So what do you do in that situation?
That's a good one. I mean, that's a good one. You've seen everything. I think at one time or another, I've seen them where the buyer, the lender says they can't buy this place unless the seller pays the closing costs right up front.
So that was part of the pre-qualification.
Yes. And so when you had to write the offer, they wrote that in there, that this loan was predicated on the seller paying the buyer's closing costs and prepaid, paid the whole thing.
So in a multiple offer situation or a really super hot market, it's going to be hard for those buyers, right? So I would suggest those buyers have extra money somewhere in their life.
Yeah. Get somebody
to help you. Yeah.
And of course, you want the seller to say yes to your offer. You want to make it as good as you can for them. And closing costs can be a very big negotiating tool in it. If you can pay your own closing costs as the buyer, geez, the seller is so much more apt to say yes to your offer than if you're asking.
And you know why else that is important, especially this time of year? Because some of those properties have been sitting since
long time,
right? But they're ready to do a price reduction, or they just did a price reduction, and you don't want to mess around. If you really want that property, then you want to write an offer where they're going to say yes, because somebody else is coming right behind you just because it's the time of year, and everybody's watching. The properties have been sitting for a long time, and maybe we're a little overpriced or something was wrong with it. So just because nobody's got an offer on it right now doesn't mean in 10 minutes somebody else won't come along.
Yeah, and before we end this segment, another good point is, what about backup offers?
I love backup offers. I think
do?
Those are great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why? Tell me why.
Because, again, this time of year, somebody might come in and negotiate a really good deal and then change their mind because something else came on the market, or they discover something about the property that really bothers them. And in Oregon, it's so easy for the buyer to exit a transaction, especially early on. And if you have a backup offer, then as a seller, you're not hurt. As a buyer, you're in first place, and you get that phone call. You have legal right to that property before anybody else.
I wish there was
it's a win-win.
I wish there was a statistic on that about how many offers actually end up that way. I don't know.
I know. I don't think anybody's tracking that.
Yeah, no, I don't think so either. It'd be interesting to know, because it happens a lot. I mean, we see in our office at John L. Scott, BOM, back on market, and you see it literally every day.
But see, if you have a backup offer, it doesn't go on market until your offer has been addressed, and you get to say yes or no.
And so as a buyer, you're saying also, don't be discouraged by that sometimes. You may just get it. So don't be afraid.
But you have to be super flexible.
Yeah, you do.
Because you don't know when you're moving.
No, yeah, you don't. Well, but you're still in the game, I guess, a little bit. Especially if you want the house or certain place that, at least gives you a chance.
And it's actually a great strategy for buyers. If you just go out and find all the properties that are in escrow right now that are in the neighborhood you want, about the price you want, and just write a backup offer on a bunch of them and see what happens.
And you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Then you can either take it away or just let it sit. So,
right, because you get the choice. You get the choice when it goes into your position.
So really, as you said, the system is pretty good for buyers. I mean, they can buy, they can get out of deals within early on better to keep your earnest money and things like that. So, but you're right. Someone makes something maybe in escrow and something else comes along that they like, and they're going to get out of that one to go to that one if they still want it. Yeah. So again, so the backup is there.
Yep, and as a seller, boy, does it feel good to have a backup offer.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, well, I like that as well. So, again, we got a break coming up here as we're kind of explore the day of what's happening in the market here as the fall comes along. And as you can see from our conversation, a lot is going on.
Yeah, it's usually pretty quiet this time of year, and it's just not. We have more showings than we had this time last year by almost 1,000. We have almost 1,000 more. We call it doors being open. Our MLS tracks how many doors are being opened, and it's almost 1,000 more than this time last year. So there's buyers out there. So if you are thinking of selling next year, maybe think about selling right now. You'll actually have more buyers.
Yeah, more buyers, and they're serious out there. They're certainly serious, and the ones that I'm working with anyway are pre-approved and ready to go. You're just trying to find the place, and the inventory is low. So that's what the market is. That's what it is. That's what supply and demand is.
That's
where we are. Okay, well, we'll see what happens. One of the other topics that talking real estate, I mean, there's so many different areas, lending. Anyway, we got one more segment to go here with Alice, Pete, and Alice today on the Real Estate Show. October the 19th is our date. A lot of activity going on. We're coming right back here to KCMX and YouTube right after this. Welcome back to the Real Estate Show on KCMX News Media 880 and on YouTube at realestateshoworegon.com. Pete Belcastro, Alice Lema here in the house today. Real Estate Brokers with John L. Scott. Boy, September was a big real estate month, wasn't it?
Oh, it was huge. Yeah, it's shocking how much real estate there's going on in Southern Oregon. It really is shocking.
Yeah, it was like $3.3 billion last year.
With a B.
Yeah, with a B in Jackson County. And boy, I don't know. I mean, I look at the stats every month, and there's still a heck of a lot being sold out there. The market, remember, changes at that $500,000 level. And above that, you've just got more inventory, less, and so it's more of a buyer's market.
Right,
and the higher end, the $1 million range, you really got a buyer's market.
Well, and there's proportionally fewer people just in the world that have enough money to qualify for that.
Yeah, it's
right.
Now, if you go below 500,000, where the rest of us live, okay, there's a lot of activity, and especially in those 150 to 250 range, my goodness, there's so many people looking for properties there, Alice, in that range.
Well, and that's really tough because a lot of those properties are not in good enough condition to finance, and so then they go either into the rehabilitation loan programs, and you have to have a stronger qualification for that, or they're cash.
Yeah, but that's again, but if you're up in the upper range in that 350 ranges and 400,000, don't you believe that they have to be pretty much move-in ready to go? You don't. I just don't think my buyers walk away from if they're not.
Well, what's the common complaint that your buyers give you when you take them into a house?
It's not move-in ready. I guess it's not maybe clean or dirty. Not necessarily that way, but they just don't like parts of it or something. I don't know.
Well, how do they react to being outdated? Maybe not having the open kitchen and kind of the older appliances and such.
A lot of it, if they can move in and everything is working, I think they're okay with it because they can change it out themselves. Some people want to change it now. Some people will wait. It depends how much money you have in reserve, right? How much you're paying. If you're paying your closing costs, or do you have an extra $10,000 that you can put towards some remodeling, right?
And that's another reason to ask the seller for closing costs so that you have that extra 9 or 10,000 to buy yourself another dishwasher.
Yeah. But I went through, in terms of remodeling your place, getting the bathrooms updated, having the kitchen, Again, we're asking a lot. These places are not cheap. This is the biggest expense you're ever going to do in your life, and the last thing I think people want to do for buyers is walk in and have to do a lot of work.
Well, and it's so hard to save up for that down payment,
Yeah.
Even if it's only 3.5% or 5% down. And then if you can do a bigger down payment so that your monthly payment will be lower, that's awesome. But it's hard. It's just hard. And I think that's the part people underestimate.
Yeah. I worked for a year because what was the one thing I had to do in buying my place was I didn't want to have mortgage insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked to get 20% down. Again, and that's the second highest number of second highest total that people put down payment on a house is 20%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Number one,
and it does.
What's number one?
3.5. It's feast or famine.
5% or less. Most people do. Okay, and then the next one is 20% down.
Yeah.
But it's just your choice if you can do that or not.
Well, and not having mortgage insurance is awesome. Plus, it insulates you a little from economic upheaval in the future because your payment is lower. So I do encourage people to have the biggest down payment possible, but not at the expense of not buying a house. You still want to buy something, especially now while it's basically free money.
Yeah, one of the things that John L. Scott sends out each month is a housing report, for Jackson County. And we've talked a lot about how important it is in the first 30 days of a listing. Mm-hmm. When you see a property go on the market, we always talk about, is it priced right, ready to go? 30 days, that's your best chance to sell, right?
It is, because you have buyers out there that have been waiting. We call it the backlog of buyers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and don't you find that your buyers are like that? They are the most educated people, and they know a good deal, and they know a good property, and when you show it to them.
And the statistics bear it out. It just, if you're 0 to 250,000 over in Jackson County, and this is from September, almost 54% were sold in that first 30 days in that price range.
That's a huge amount. Okay,
and then it goes down from that. 250 to 350 is almost 50%. And then when you get into the higher ranges, let's see, 750,000 to $1 million in the first 30 days in Jackson County, 14%.
Wow.
Sold. And you go to the 120-day mark, they're still well over half. So again, that first 30 days is so critical that you have it priced right and ready to go.
Even in the higher price ranges.
Even in the higher price
I still maintain, don't you think that just because it's $1 million property, you should still be in escrow in 4 to 6 weeks? It shouldn't take 8 months. Something's wrong if it's taking that long, even in those higher price points.
Well, you're right, but that luxury market is certainly is really weak, even on these stats.
Well, it's because there's so many properties to choose from.
Yeah.
So if you want to be the next one to close escrow,
it's a lot.
Then you have to position yourself that way.
It's like seven. If I could do that quickly, like 75 properties in that
and
luxury property in the market. That's a lot.
And some of the hemp people are starting to buy those just as part of their business extensions, so they can have buildings to do their processing and drying in, because they can't find commercial supply.
And I think over the winter you're going to see a great surge in greenhouse building, climate-controlled greenhouse building to dry this crop. It's got to be dried here. I mean, we have to be able to handle that, and hopefully our leaders in our economic development, Frank Mania last week, he was talking about this, where are they? Why aren't we hearing about processing done here and being able to use that, this great crop that we have that has so much potential for jobs?
But it's forcing, the need is so great, it's forcing those people to make a choice.
Like okay.
Yeah, so I'm really curious to see over the winter if some of those bigger million-dollar, multi-million-dollar spreads that have a lot of outbuildings, have multiple home dwellings on them, have irrigation, flat usable farmland, that whole I'm curious to see how many of those sell over the winter.
I wonder that, there's some beautiful farm properties out there. I wonder if we're going to see many. That'd be interesting to see.
It will.
Because many people say, I'm keeping my property now. I can lease this. So,
well, that too, yeah, but they may not even want to see the house. They might just want to go right to the outbuildings.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We started talking about hemp an hour ago, and we end up talking about it as well, Alice, because, again, it's such a topic that wherever you go, people are talking about this, and we're learning. We're all learning together. Cannabis was this way a few years ago, remember, and we went through that boom and bust cycle. Now we're at the hemp cycle, and we'll see how that goes. What happens next year will be the key.
Yep.
If the same growers come back, the same properties are used, or they're not.
And if we have any more commercial buildings that go on the market over the winter.
Well, I think that's the end of our show tonight. And I think hopefully
that was so fast.
You learned something today from our discussion here, buying and selling. It's a great art form, and having the experts like agents around like Alice Wright can really help you. It really makes it a lot more fun because we've been through it. We've been through
well,
those
and we can
rags.
help you avoid the pitfalls,
We
right? Yeah, anticipate, exactly.
We want to reduce the level of your uncomfortableness in buying or selling a home. That's kind of what it comes down to. So I'm going to see, you predicted, Alice has predicted that we're going to defy the fall selling cycle here in the next few months. So I just think you might be right compared to other years, and we'll see if that's true, because there's just a lot of activity going on.
Don't you have a lot of people still looking?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I do too.
I'm just amazed at the amount of buyers that are out there and wanting and looking, and many have been looking, and they're approved, ready to go. It's the inventory that's out there that's low. They're not seeing what they want, but they're out there, so it's going to be a very interesting time ahead. Anyway, next week, the assessor will be here, so we hope you'll join us as we're going to talk property taxes and see what's going on with that. That in itself is a whole discussion that is very, very interesting as well. Alice, thank you for being here today. We'll catch you next week as well. Let's say thanks to Brett Nance, who runs our camera from John L. Scott's. Well, Brett works with Alice, and so all of that. Thank you for being with us. Have a great week, everybody, and God bless you all.